everyone. Welcome to the session. I'm Naveen. I focus on research and knowledge at Societal Platform. This is the second of our series called Societal Dialogues, where we are aiming to focus on some of the key and emerging ideas in the Societal Platform and the development space. 3 weeks back, we did our first session. We facilitated a discussion on the topic of agency with e-governance foundation. Today's session on ecosystem governance is a collaboration between Rohini, Nilekani Philanthropies, Societal Platform, and our research partner, Aapti Institute. In this session, we have participants from Societal Platform missions and also Project Aspire, which is an initiative we have with Ashoka. Once again, welcome and thank you for joining. We're looking forward to hear your perspectives and experiences. Kani, if you could just share the agenda. Yeah, so the next 90 minutes is divided into primarily 2 parts. The part 1 is for 20 to 25 minutes. We'll hear from the teams, from you, and we'll present the findings of the research on ecosystem governance. Then in part 2 is where we are most excited to hear from you, your insights, your ideas on some of the findings that we'll be sharing as part of this session. We will have a discussion around the 3 core findings because we thought it would be easier to discuss on some of the key ideas rather than going through the entire research. So we will do a 5-minute brief explanation on the core findings and around 15 minutes of discussion on each finding. Where particularly we encourage you to share your thoughts and also in terms of how do you envision the implementation of some of the principles that we will be sharing in the session. And also if there's any feedback that you have, please do share. On that note, we wanted to start with opening remarks from Sanjay Purohit, the Chief Curator of Societal Platform. But unfortunately, Sanjay is not able to attend today's session, but he has shared a note with us. I will read it out. And after that, it will be followed by remarks from Gautam John, Director of Strategy at Nilekani Philanthropies, on why this topic is of importance to all of us and what is he most excited about the outcomes of the research also. So I'll just give me a second. I'll read out what Sanjay had shared. Yeah. Quote, for the longest time, it was believed that what is good for platforms is bad for ecosystems. What is in favor of Uber might restrict the agency of drivers. What works for Swiggy might bleed the margins of restaurant owners. Sangeet Paul Chaudhary has done some amazing work in this area. With Societal Platform, our endeavor is to truly change this narrative and make platforms work in the service of society, putting society before platforms. This research with Aapti is our effort to provide a framework to think about pathways to infuse societal values into governance of the platforms that we work on. By being informed of the needs of both builders and users on the platform, the principles that we have identified through this study we believe will aid thoughtful design of societal platforms and also support constructive debate around openness, control, and rights through platforms. I would now like to request Gautam John to share his opening remarks. Over to you, Gautam.
Thank you, Naveen. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. 2020 is the year where being with people essentially means being on the other end of a camera, but it's better than not being able to have this conversation at all. It's a pity, Sanjay, I couldn't be in this conversation. In a sense, the presentation of this report and the discussion around it marks a very key milestone in a conversation that Sanjay and I had begun discussing a couple of years ago now. And it really came from the thinking that while the idea of societal platform thinking was one that we were able to express very clearly in terms of a platform. We were a little bit behind in terms of being able to express what the societal aspect of the platform was and how the societal and the platform interacted with each other. In particular, while the technical architecture of a societal platform model can be well defined, we've always felt that there must be an architecture of governance for these platforms and the ecosystem around that evolves around them, around ownership, rule-making, liability, and accountability. And since these platforms are designed ab initio to be made by many, to be open, to be participatory, to be distributive, we were very keen in being able to create the nub of a governance framework that mirrors this, that mirrors for the diversity, that mirrors for the value of openness, that mirrors for co-creation, and that mirrors, the intent of behind societal platform thinking, which is to restore agency. And something that Rohini has been talking about a lot is that intent alone is a good starting point, but is insufficient. And what we need is the grammar of intent. And that is what we hope and believe that Aapti and Societal Platform team and all of you have been able to start to articulate. What is the grammar of intent of the societal in the platform universe? What does it mean to say platforms in service of society? So the technical architecture is a very important part of it, but the framework of ownership, of decision making, and of governance is as important as that. And it's the intersection between the two that truly make platforms in service of society. And the questions that we were asking ourselves is, if the goal is not to hoard, but to channel scarce resources at scale, what are the appropriate governance models that are as participatory as the platform itself? And that if societal platforms encourage participation in solutioning on top of them, then should we not encourage the same co-ownership in the design and iteration of the platform itself? I think, Lawrence Lessig, who is an icon of mine, has this wonderful quote that says, what the architecture enables and how it limits its control are choices. And what I am excited about is the fact that we are engaging in this conversation around the governance as a set of choices we're making collectively in influencing the architecture of participation, the architecture of design, and the architecture of control. Finding the representation of the core values of societal platform thinking, restoring agency, scale, networks, distributing the ability to solve, inspiring co-creation, and being able to create systemic leadership are pieces that are foundational pivots of what an ecosystem governance approach needs to include. And as you will see, we're very happy that together, along with Aapti and all of you as missions and mission leaders have been able to articulate some foundational starting points for this. I think it's important to recognize that what we have are not answers. What we have is a good starting point for a much more involved and deeper discussion around what the choices we make in the governance of our independent platforms and missions is, but also what the importance of governance is in determining the future of platforms, not just at the level of each mission, but at the level of public platforms in service of societies for countries like India and for the global South at large. Because we have an opportunity to create a narrative, and the importance of platforms in service of Samaj or society is different from platforms in service of markets or platforms in service of governance alone. And that really is the space I find tremendously exciting that is emerging from these conversations. So with that, I have very little to add other than this, and hand over to Sarayu and the team at Aapti to take us forward.
Thanks, Gautam, and thank you, Naveen. Hi, I'm Sarayu from Aapti Institute, and part of the team, along with Kani, who you will meet shortly, who's been part of thinking about this governance framework for societal platforms. As Gautam said, and I think as Sanjay also indicated, our starting question was infusing society and societal thinking into platform thinking and bringing them together in order to be able to both, drive and determine and frame action, but also have a set of principles that act as a cornerstone that one can keep going back to. Just to get us started in talking about the research, what we did was to think about situating these values in ideas of societal platform thinking itself, and to begin with the idea of a societal platform as one that has a mission which is centered on certain values and principles. And it's easy to say, but something that needs to be said very, very often, and is one that is rooted in the idea of rights, equity, and the ability to enable choice, nurture dignity, and restore agency. So very much societal platforms, unlike commercial platforms or ones that don't have express or imagined societal aims, are ones that come from wanting to and needing to change something about society. The other idea about thinking about societal platforms, and therefore any kind of principles that govern thinking around these platforms, is the idea that very many of these values are not necessarily ones that can be established through control mechanisms, but ones that need to be established through relational approaches. And by this, we mean being able to embed these values and this thinking into the culture of organizations, into every action that is taken, and into every aspect of design. So it's not something necessarily that can be framed as a set of controls or as a set of processes at every point of time. What we have done, and this is very much an early part of the work, is begin to articulate some of these principles of good governance. And the idea or the starting point that we came from in doing this is to say that stakeholders must rely on each other's resources, or must be able to use each other's resources to achieve these better societal outcomes with improved efficiency. So this idea of leveraging each other's resources, of coming together, is very integral. It's integral to the idea of platforms, and I think there's a whole lot of literature that talks about it as well, but it's also integral to this idea of governance. The other, of course, is that we try to do with this set of principles is to embed these values in the platform thinking, and these are drawn from ideas of constitutionalism, democratic values, as well as ideas of individual and liberty, The primary focus, and just to dig into the framework of Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, I realize there are global participants here, but the idea of having market, societal, and government platforms is something that's central to this thinking. But in this specific piece of work, we focus on societal and government platforms much more. The value systems and the frameworks are similar, but we hope to be able to talk a little bit more about market-based platforms over time. In this discussion itself, what we hope to do is to discuss some of the concerns, limitations, and challenges of the way these principles have been articulated, and then take it back to be able to, iterate to the next stage as well. So before we jump into talking about the principles, I have a little bit more to share about how we did this, and it's important because in a certain way, what we tried to do was to have the process also reflect the way in which platforms must be governed, which is co-created through collaboration. So we used very much a collaborative process in order to arrive at these principles. So we spoke to experts and some practitioners, and we recognize the limitations of this. We have not necessarily spoken to communities of users or communities of interest in platforms, and this is something that we hope to address over time. But what we did was, building from desk research, we had conversations with a few experts, those who've been thinking about platforms widely, and then also brought together a few of the societal platforms missions to discuss a draft set of principles that we built up from the expert interviews and the desk research. So this is very much a result of various conversations with the ecosystem. And as Gautam indicated, this has been a conversation that has been in a certain way in the making, or a part of Aapti's thinking as well for a period of time. So it feels very much like it's the culmination of something, and also a starting point for much, much more. So I'll jump straight into discussing the framework that we arrived at. If you could go to the next slide, Kani. To discuss the framework that we arrived at. What we'll be doing today is to focus on a smaller subset of the 10 principles that we've arrived at, and the entire report with the research as well as the documentation of the interview conversations is available. It's linked in the PPT and will be shared with you. But what we hope to do is to discuss a few of these principles in a little bit more detail to understand the experiences of the practitioners in the room. Just taking a step back, when Aapti approached it from the research perspective, what we arrived at was a set of 10 principles that could be said to speak to each other, but are also in a certain way independent of each other. But what has happened since the time that we did the research to the conversations that we've been having with societal platforms is that they've been evolved into much more of a framework. So we see these, and with societal platforms, see these as 3 central principles, which we'll be discussing today, with 2 supportive principles. And I guess Sanjay's presence would have made this description much, much better. But the visualization is that of a water molecule, which with these central principles playing the role of the oxygen, and the 2 supporting principles which are related, being the hydrogen atoms that are connected to each other through the oxygen molecule. And then there's a fundamental underlying principle, which you could call the container, you could call it the tumbler that holds the water in, and that would be the idea of being for and of the society. And I'll talk a little bit about being for and of society and this framework before I hand it over to Kani, who will discuss each of these principles in and of themselves. But the container principle for all of this, and this harks back to what Gautam mentioned and Sanjay's comment as well, the idea that what is distinct about a societal platform is that it's for the society and it's of the society. And being able in every action to embody these concerns and these ideas and this articulation of the mission is what makes the societal platform societal. So it seems obvious in a certain way. So, you know, it's very tempting to say, well, it's a societal platform and therefore we know that it's societal, but to be able to articulate it and say and enact being for and of society is very, very critical. We see that as being 2 things that are related to each other. One is the idea of having co-creation, which is bringing together those communities and those who are most affected by platforms or communities of interest into the process of design and building in itself. The other aspect of this is to have communities and society in that sense be very much a part of the governance and decision-making process in and of itself. So this means pulling stakeholders into governance, both formal and informal. One example of this could be Amul, which is not so much a societal platform in the technological sense, but is one where the community of stakeholders has been an integral part of Amul's governance through the years. Other examples could be microfinance companies that have community trusts that are a part of the governance processes. So being for and of society is as much an ideal as much as it is an act, and that's what we hope this principle embodies. So I will stop at this moment and hand over to Kani, who will walk you through the 3 principles. And just housekeeping, after each principle, we'll be having about 15 minutes of discussion. So look forward to having a conversation there as well. So over to you, Kani.
Yeah. So I'll start off with the first principle. The first one is biasing for interactions to deliver impact. Platforms generally, they derive value from the interactions which happen on the platform, and considering it from a societal perspective, it's really important to identify which interactions derive the maximum value so that it leads to the desired impact. In that case, it's very essential to identify key interactions which happen on the platform, and also to amplify those interactions so that the impact is also evenly distributed to all communities of interest. In that context, for example, in Eco India, there is the key value interaction is considered between the expert doctors and the primary healthcare workers based in each hub. but the interaction is not that of an instructive model, but more of a conversational model. So the primary healthcare workers bring their own case models, and then they discuss it with the expert doctor so as to get their opinions, so that the capacity building happens in the case of all primary healthcare workers. So this is the key interaction on the platform, and Eco India has strived to make sure that this interaction is amplified and it's more, nuanced, so that this is the one which drives impact. This has been transformational in their approach, and they have made sure that the entire governance process is surrounded around this, so that the impact is amplified. But again, coming back to the point, but amplification does not happen by itself, and we need to make sure that the entire ecosystem of players support this. And the other point is that when the platforms scale, when the platforms increase in their sizes, like how do we make sure that these kind of interactions are amplified at each point, and how do we make sure that there is no there is bound to conflict, conflicts are bound to arise? So how do we make sure that the processes are governed in such a way that those conflicts do not arise also? So these are some of the concerns which we sort of went through when we were trying to think about this principle. So Sarai, do you want to take on?
Of course.
Yeah.
As Kani said, and this speaks to the fundamental principle around being for and of society as well. The idea that interactions that drive the maximum impact or the most significant impact that is desired are the ones that platform governance must index for, as most apparent in the case of ECHO. I'm going to throw open the room for questions and discussion. These are a few of the questions that were surfaced as we undertook the interviews with the experts, as well as with very many of those present in the room as well. The idea that how do you determine which interactions lead to the impact, as well as who decides what interactions are, who decides what interactions lead to impact, and who decides how do you centralize those or sort of privilege those in the process of governance. And then, of course, what if there are multiple and potentially conflicting ones that drive this kind of impact, and what if sometimes some of these undermine the agency? And this is a conversation actually that occurred in the context of ECHO as well, is that if you want to bias for an interaction between healthcare workers and doctors that is conversational, does that in a certain way undermine the agency of one of those actors to behave in the way that they would wish to with this platform? So those are the framing thoughts, but I'll throw it open, both the framework of the principles as well as this specific principle for discussion. I request you to please unmute yourself and raise the question. Otherwise, we can take the questions that are in the chat as well.
How do you determine which features or interactions get priority? Because there are multiple stakeholders on that, and different people may want different interactions which is beneficial for them. How do you identify the dominant ones?
Right. Right. May I ask if that's KK from eGov?
Yes.
Right. Hello. Thank you very much for that question. Absolutely. That is the question that we ask ourselves, and this would vary very much depending on the context, because what is the most important interaction or the most impactful interaction in the context of an e-governance might be very different from what it is in the context of ECO. What we learned in the process of conversation is the idea that this has to be determined at the platform level through a process of engaging with each other as well as engaging with the communities of impact. And it's very much a dynamic and evolving process. So the supporting principles, and Kani, may I request you to go back into the slide with the H2O molecules. The supporting principles in the context of indexing for impact are the ones that relate to making accessible co-creation a habit, which is making co-creation with the stakeholders as well as with communities of interest a part of the platform design itself, as well as collaborating with formal and offline and informal, in both formal and informal offline architectures can actually play a significant role in being able to clearly identify this. But we recognize that this is a process. But if there's anybody else amongst the group that wants to jump in as well, request you to do so.
Can I come in? Hi, this is Shelja. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for this. I wanted to bring in a slightly practical point of view, if I may, which is a large part of what we do within societal platforms is, at least in first few instances, funded either by investors or funders, and those dynamics also come into play. So I think there was a second question that you had later on in terms of which translates loosely. I'm going to that next slide. In terms of what are the interactions that drive this impact and who decides actually, sorry, yes, that was the one. How does one accommodate for that in early stage where you still haven't been able to showcase the impacts? I don't know if the question makes sense, but just wanted to place it here.
Right. Right. I don't know if I have an answer to that, and we absolutely understand that there are practical constraints and also the stage of evolution in a certain way of the platform, as well as who's funding it and their interests and their sort of inclinations. So we realize that this is a dynamic process, but we think being able to articulate, and this is again what we heard from both the practitioners in the roundtable as well as the expert interviews, is the idea that it's important to articulate impact or at least attempt to do it. And we recognize that it's very much a process. And, you know, we will come to the third set of, I want to say it's the third fundamental principle, which is the idea of evolvability. So we do not believe that very many of these ideas are fixed, constant, and eternal, though there is a certain fundamental character to them. But invite more perspectives from the room, because this is actually a question we struggled with very much. It's subjective because it depends on the context, it depends on the nature of the platform, as well as the stage of the platform. So I hope that answered your question, Shailaja. Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, can I go next?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm part of the team on working on the project Aspire. So very much at the beginning of the learning curve on the societal platform bit. So pardon me if my questions are too naive or my answers are too naive. But learning from some similar experiences, what I feel in such as a response to these three questions, an important issue is around leadership and what form of leadership is put in place for governing such kind of societal platforms. A distributed leadership or a leadership that is based on the consensus of the various participants in that system. And if it is the latter, then a periodic review puts in place certain standards, certain indices, which would then become the basis of deciding what is a desired impact in terms of quality and outreach, etc. So really, that's my experience here. The role of leadership in such kind of and a different form of leadership in such kind of a ecosystem frameworks. Yeah.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. And in a certain way, leadership is also like a critical underlying thread that goes through being able to articulate impact, but also maintain that razor sharp focus on this idea of the desired impact. But to add to the questions, one of the themes that came up both in the research as well as in this conversation is this idea of potentially the idea of sort of this conflict between different individuals or different stakeholders' agency, and would love to hear both of experiences and ways to think about how to navigate some of these conflicts.
We would love to hear from some of the societal platform missions also based on your experience. I could just request you if that's okay. Prasanna from Shiksha Lokam, is there anything that you would like to share in this? Your experiences at Shiksha Lokam?
Sorry, I'm outside. I can't able to speak now. Apologies. Yeah.
No problem. Vineet from Digital Green. Okay.
Right.
I think, Sarah, we could move to the next one.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's do that. And please do, if there are any additional comments or observations, please note them in the chat. Over to Kani to discuss the second principle.
So moving on to the second principle, embedding accountability. So in case of any platform, clear articulation of accountable frameworks and legal frameworks is really essential for all of the players involved and the ecosystem involved in the societal platform. So in that context, we are taking the example of this performance appraisal report, which is to be filed by bureaucrats within a specific timeline, but it was always being submitted late, and it was not necessarily used in the manner it was supposed to be used. So using the digital platform of Sparrow, it was decided that the specific reports have to be logged in within a specific timeline with a lock-in period, which sort of gave it the individual accountability for the persons to file within that timeline. So deriving from that, codification of such accountable processes is really essential, which comes by delineating responsibility to each of the specific stakeholders or the actors involved. In that context, Samaj platforms have like low expected levels of accountability, whereas Sarkar platforms have a very high expected levels of accountability. And also, in considering like the governance processes with respect to accountability, there could be only like an overarching framework, while the local nitty-gritties could be figured out only by the actors involved in the specific context, so that they would be able to decide better. And a related process with accountability is the grievance redressal mechanism. The governance processes and the grievance redressal mechanism should be designed in such a way that it is equitable to all, it is accessible by all. In that context, also a related thing is collaborating with offline mechanisms, where collaborating with such offline mechanisms will help in grievance redressal in reaching the digitally access. Yeah. Sarah, you want to take over?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So absolutely. If there are any questions, Kani, could you go to the next slide, please? Right. So just the idea of accountability is again something that came up both in the literature and in the desk research as well as in the conversations we had, because it is truly one of it's truly confusing in a certain way, because there is the need to think about accountability as liability, but there's also the need to think about accountability as something that that is a value system that platforms are able to give, or platforms imagine for themselves in the course of their design. A few questions that additionally sort of arose as a part of the various discussions and conversations is the idea of building buy-in around accountability, especially if they're not derived from legal or regulatory expectations. So when a law or a code very clearly says that this is the standard to be met, well, then it becomes fairly easy. In some ways, while that might not be the best frame or the best outcome, building buy-in around that is not as difficult as when it is something that is more normative or more value-based. So that's the one thing that we grappled with for sure in the context of accountability. The other, of course, is the idea of accountability as being able to provide dispute resolution mechanisms in the context of platforms for communities of interest and for stakeholders. But how can they themselves be designed to ensure that they truly involve those stakeholders and provide true access for them. And therefore, another question that also results out of the conversation was the idea that the levels of accountability for Sarkar and versus other platforms, and I think Gautam in the chat has also alluded to questions on this. So this is another thing that arose as a part of the discussions around accountability in the context of platforms. But I'll hand it over to the group as well to be able to talk about this a little bit more and their experience as well. So over to everybody.
Do we have any idea about how the accountability gets formally or informally established in a platform?
Right. I would request other participants as well to jump in on this. But what we learned was there are two ways in which accountability is established. One is the formal mechanisms, which is through the board, the board as well as sort of other regulations and laws that a platform is subject to. So, for example, like local governance rules and regulations are those that apply to platforms that work in that domain. The other is the more complicated part, which is normative accountability, as we should be accountable to citizens. And KK, if I couldn't make out if that was you, but again, in the context of eGov, this is a conversation we have sometimes as to whether the idea of reaching every citizen and being able to be accessible to every citizen, even if it's not necessarily expressly stated, it is something that a platform that works at the intersection of citizenship, governance, and claim making should be able to do. So that is much more because if the design of the platform tends to exclude certain communities or certain groups for whatever reason, then these normative and value-based systems start to come into play. But would request others also to jump in. And Naveen, if you could sort of identify who these individuals might be.
Hi, this is Shelja again, and I had a separate question, and this is for mutual accountability on a platform. So, so one is the accountability that the platform should hold for the stakeholders who are involved and using the services. But then there's also the reverse accountability potentially that one should make clear. And to give an example, if you are running a youth platform to bring together and collectivize young people for whatever, there needs to be accountability both ways. Was there anything in your findings in terms of creating and developing accountability both ways, the users as well as the providers?
Right. There is a little bit, and a lot of that comes from, some of it comes from the literature, and it's referred to in the report as well, but from the work of Sangeet Paul Chaudhary and a couple of others who talk about this idea of sort of a relational accountability that is amongst the participants on the platform themselves. So if you look at the, Kani, may I request you to go back to the H2O slide? I think that's the best way to call this slide. But the idea that accountability is something that needs to be embedded, and what we also heard in this context, Shailja, to answer the question, is the idea of partitioning decision rights, which is that each unit or each entity on the platform, the roles, responsibilities, and boundary conditions are fairly well established, as well as accountability through the lens of funding are ways not only to ensure accountability to the stakeholders, but mutual accountability amongst the participants themselves. I wonder if that spoke to your question. I don't know if there's an answer in any specific way, but being able to have mutually aligned and mutually well-established responsibility amongst the participants, as well as knowing clearly the ways in which funding affects these decisions, are critical to embedding accountability amongst the platforms themselves. Right. Right. If you could go back to the question slide, Kani. Right. Is there, from your experiences, is there somebody who could speak to the idea of designing dispute resolution mechanisms to involve all stakeholders? This is something that we would love to learn a little bit more about. Right. Right. Please continue the discussion on the chat as well. And perhaps, Naveen, if this makes sense, could we move on to the third principle?
Yeah, yes.
Right. Kani, may I request you to go to the third one?
So the third principle we thought of was the designing for evolvability. So there are a set of norms which sort of appear like the core values, and then a set of norms which appear as like evolving norms according to the democratic or social ideals of the prevalent times. So the governance as the technical architectures which evolve, which with subsequent iterations, the governance values should also evolve with them as the platform scales. So with regards to this, in the example of Eco India, there are hubs and there are like super hubs. These hubs over the time when they sort of like incorporate more and more stakeholders, they transform into super hubs. So to maintain the level of standards, there is a fidelity team which makes sure that the values and norms which are established for governance purposes are being adhered to in every stage. So this role of this evolvability is also getting ensured here. In moving forward, as the platform also scales, how do we make sure that there is inclusion of new stakeholders into the governance mechanism, so that it's really like it's prevalent, it's concurrent? And also the other thing is, at what stage do we consider a value to be it is considered enough to be included as a value in the governance processes, and how do we distinguish between which is a core value and which is an evolving value? These are some of the questions which we came across. And also the other thing is that there should be right checks and balances, and also distributed leadership with regards to diverse experiences, so that the platform is up to date with everything. Do you want to open up with a question, Sarai?
Yep. Yes, please. If you could go to the next slide as well.
Yeah.
Right. So, as Kani mentioned, the core challenge that we ran up against is the idea of identifying what is core versus evolving values. And again, this goes back to the fundamental principle of A, being foreign of society, and B, being societal platforms needing to bias for interactions that deliver maximum impact. The other, of course, is this fundamental question. We talk about it, the idea of privilege and being able to determine the course of how interactions evolve or how platforms are designed. The idea of who is responsible and in what way does this responsibility speak to the other values of co-creation and community-based governance. The last, of course, and I think Shailaja also alluded to it, and a couple of other participants did bring it up as well, the idea of this being context dependent and very much dependent on the trajectory of the platform at a particular point of time. These are, again, these are questions, and platforms have grappled with them in different ways, but would love to hear responses from the group as to their experiences in grappling with this question of evolution and evolvability.
Hi, if I may come in here. This is Manu. Just on this question about core versus evolving values, I mean, again, speaking more from experience, I find that, core values are always the values that are in essence the founding values, the values that actually designed or architected that system in the first place. Whereas evolving values are values that may have been brought in by the changing composition of stakeholders, users, and such like. And I think, going by, again, experience of working in platforms of different, like global as well as some at regional level, I find that what we need to really protect at all points is the core values and not make them kind of non-negotiable. Whereas evolving values are values that are more context dependent, they are more time dependent, right. And therefore, one may want to bring them in, do a review periodically, and allow them to evolve also with time. Right. So that's been my experience on this. Yeah.
Right. Right. And Shailaja, I noticed that you also made a note. Would you like to articulate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just re-articulating what I wrote because especially in the development sector, responding to what the society wants or, what's happening across various communities, you need to also look at evolving strategies. And I completely agree with Manu in to say that there need to be non-negotiable core values, but to accommodate for changing times, changing perspectives, responding to the needs that you must, and having therefore a peripheral set of evolving values so that you're not stuck and you're not rigid is I guess a great way of looking at it.
Absolutely. That's actually a notion that we encountered in the conversations as well. And Kani, if I may request you to go back to the H2O slide, if you look at the sub-principles around designing for evolvability, both relate in a certain way to the points Manu and you articulated, which is nurturing, being able to identify core versus what needs to evolve, and being responsive most of all to the needs of the community. But the ways in which this might be done are also nurturing this idea of like relational management, which is that you embed it as a value system and think about these as fundamental to the organization rather than build them as hard-coded command and control kind of mechanisms. And the other, of course, that came up very strongly is building the capacity itself to amplify these values, which means that you as an organization and at the platform level think about bringing on individuals that share these value systems. And these three together, the idea of aspiring for evolvability through both the process as well as the capacity, is really at the heart of thinking about ecosystem governance in this context. So yes, this is something that very much resonates with what we heard.
Also, if I like to add on this point around the value systems and the other important issue about agency. I mean, I think if by design, there is a strong sense of agency or ownership among the stakeholders, I find always that the core values get strengthened over a period of time. Whereas, there is less dependence on the evolving value systems, right. Which is, I think we should create we should be okay with that in some sense, and that also kind of goes back to the other questions of the quality of impact as well as accountability,
right?
And credibility of such platforms,
right. Right, no, absolutely. And absolutely, that is a notion that we grappled with as well in the course of these conversations. Are there any other views? I'm afraid that in the absence of being able to see, we're forced to sort of urge an egg participation on, but request you all to jump in if you would like.
If possible, Ashraf, if you could speak, would love to get your thoughts on this particularly, if you could.
Did you say Ashraf?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, Naveen, I have to confess, and I'm sorry everybody, there was some emergency, just some COVID emergency in the system. I have joined very late. I just joined.
Okay. Sure, no problem.
I don't want to at the moment. I'm really out of total context clearly, but I'm totally in tune with the last piece that I heard, this particular conversation about the core values and the connection, a collective process. I mean, how the collective has been nurtured, how the organizing, but that's really, sorry, very, very superficial at the moment because I haven't connected to the previous part of the presentation. I'm really sorry. Forgive me, everybody. Yeah.
No problem.
May I request Aravind and Srinivasan to elaborate as well? He's left a comment on the chat, and if it's feasible, to talk a little bit about the linkage between leadership, purpose, and values.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, at least the platform that I am part of, I have seen that these platforms take immense value when there is a burning crisis at hand, right? And those usually energize and bring the collective together. And then after that, because of that one common joint pursuit that everyone runs a sprint together or runs something together, the values get shaped in that journey. And then after that, I've seen usually that when those those burning issues are kind of resolved, it's not, and just to take an example, for instance, when COVID hit and we were trying to talk to a lot of different partners around how do we protect sanitation workers. There's a lot of collective urgency shown by all partners to share insights. How is different states in different cities undertaking these initiatives, and in that process, the value system emerges, right? Because now everyone's priority is more external oriented, saying this is the purpose that we are trying to solve for, and so this is the need. Whereas in other cases where we have felt, when we are jointly just curating knowledge for the sake of the knowledge commons, the value system starts changing, right? A lot of questions over property rights or IP rights, and how do we give credits, and one platform over another platform, and all those typical market forces questions also start coming in, because there is no sense of urgency. There's no sense of common purpose, because it's a never-ending journey, so to speak. So the value system again kind of fluidly changes, is what I was trying to say. And at least when there is a common leadership, the boundaries can be slightly enforced to ensure that those mutual respectful principles are maintained. That's what I'm
doing. Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And if I may request, one of the earlier parts of the discussion, I think Gautam Ravichandar from eGovernments brought up this question of the idea of marketplace platforms and their evolvability. The one conflict or concern that we ran up against is the idea that for market-based platforms that prioritize profit to start with, how does evolvability come into play? Because then do societal aims in a certain way fall by the wayside in pursuing these market aims? So if there's anybody with experience to that, would love to hear your views on it.
I don't have experience, but I could add a view.
Yes, please.
So the viewpoint I'm hearing more and more, and what I'm kind of reflecting with is, it comes down to what is the purpose of the platform in that sense, right? And so it would be unfair to impose a different set of values and principles on a platform that is designed for a very clear thing, right? Market say, I need to make certain amount of money. There are people who are invested in that. There are investors who are invested in that, and there are stakeholders who cater to that. Societal platforms are really a kind of response in my mind to the fact that you need platforms for areas where markets are pathetic at really responding and solving. So you have some of these organizations coming together to develop these societal platforms, but suddenly expecting markets to turn societal is, I think, a bridge too far, and definitely not something we should be imposing on them. It's let me ask you the counter question. Why not impose profit objectives on societal platforms so that we are all equally sustainable? And then let's have the conversation on how that shifts our incentives. Right. So it's just like, what is the incentive you want people to work towards?
Right.
And my thing is, if the market by galti se in the chasing of profit, they deliver societal benefits, great, good for us. But if we make that the primary objective of the market, then we've lost what the market is there for.
Right. No, absolutely. That's absolute. I agree by and large. I think among societal platforms that do, among platforms that do from the market side that do deliver societal aims, is there something to think about in the context of governance and whether these can be imposed? I don't think they can be imposed unless they come from a legal or regulatory framework. But of course, that's the subject of much vibrant discussion as to what the markets can do and what is the bound of its ability to actually enhance human well-being and existence. I would love to sort of just go back before we begin to wrap up, and I invite comments from Astha as a response. If we could go back to the slide with H2O again, just to highlight that a couple of things. One is that these principles are very much principles. They are meant to frame thinking and advise action, though they need much more work and much more conversations in order to be able to actually drive actions on the ground. And second, to think of all of these principles as things that speak to each other, to think of impact without being able to think of collaborating with offline infrastructures, or even the capacity to amplify the values of which one of them is actually delivering this impact, is actually not possible. So to think of these very much as network, very much like a platform in and of themselves, where the values speak, interact with each other, and grow stronger in and of themselves, is something that's critical to this thinking. The other aspect of this is we hope very much to be able to build on these through many more conversations, and particularly with the communities that of interest for very many of the societal platforms in this room today. So this is a starting frame, and getting into the how-tos, being able to calibrate for contexts, for values, is something that's very important in evolving this thinking. At this juncture, I will hand over to...
question or make a submission?
Yes, please.
So
yes,
I think
please.
It's good to have this conversation among societal platforms. It's also very important for us to bring in people from other fields, right? So where is the government? Where are the community organizations? Where are the civil society guys? So that what is their reaction to this would be something I would be very curious to think about.
Right. No, of course, we would love to have more wider engagement on this, because this is very much like you pointed out, an initial sort of exercise where we brought together people that we know and that are a part of the societal platform ecosystem, but being able to have this thinking resonate more widely in the ecosystem and having responses and having the limitations highlighted is critical. So agreed, Gautam. Right. I'd like to, at this juncture, hand over to Astha, who's the co-founder of Aapti Institute, to jump in and respond both to the framework and to the thinking that underlies it. So over to you, Astha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this discussion and for the presentation. And I mean, I just had a few high-level comments. First on just the idea of principles themselves, because we are now living in a space where there are so many principles for so many different things. You know, you have the AI principles, and then you have principles for data sharing. We've also been trying to make principles for data stewardship. So I think this question of principles is becoming a big one. And I think that it's because we're trying to sort of add values and core values to a set of technologies that are at the moment, or at least not imagined to be anchored by certain societal values. So to that extent, and also that this method has been quite an interesting one. I've been looking at methods of building principles in other areas of technology, and I realized that it's actually just not been method driven. So to that end, I think that at least for me, this process has been really illuminating and on how to build principles in a collaborative manner. The second question that comes up is then, how do we think about instantiating a lot of these principles? I think that the conversation that has happened today has demonstrated that while conceptually there's some agreement around it, but the way that these principles will manifest themselves in different contexts and different societal platforms, whether it's, as Gautam said, like, you know, how does this work on the bazaar or market platforms versus societal or government platforms, is a big question. And I also suspect that they'll be different across sectors, across, you know, the degrees of interaction with communities. All of that is something that will define how these principles are instantiated, and some platforms may optimize for one versus the other. So how do we also balance them within each platform is something that needs to be possibly worked out. And then finally, I think that this question of leadership that came up also in the comments and then is critical, and how do we think about embedding this not just in the platforms but in the leadership in the funding ecosystem is also something that needs to be considered, because oftentimes, and all of us who've been running organizations will know that a lot of this gets lost because we are in many ways determined by what funders and give primacy to. So how do we not just embed these in the platforms but also in the broader ecosystem, especially the funding ecosystem, is another critical thought that I guess needs to be considered. But in all I think like Sanjay Purohit said, like society before platforms is critical, and if this is indeed the grammar of intent, I think we need to think about how this grammar then translates into practice and implementation.
Thank you very much, Astha.
Thank you. Thank you, Astha. Thank you, Sarayu. Thank you, Kani, for the wonderful presentation. So I think we could close the session. Thank you all for joining. This is one of several conversations that we would like to have. I think Vinita just commented.
Right. If I may take this gap while Naveen pauses to just add, please do feel free to reach out to us at Aapti. We're at contact@aapti.in, as well as on various social media. We believe that this is very much the start of a conversation and not the end. So the principles then in and of themselves must be evolvable. We certainly believe that. And to Gautam, Ravichandar's point earlier, being able to be accountable to a wider network or a wider community of civil society and participants is also actually critical for the principles themselves. So we see this as a conversation starter. We recognize that they're esoteric and hard to translate in the immediate instant into action at the platform level and into action. But let's keep this conversation going, and that's what we'd like to leave you with for sure. So over to Naveen.
Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful to hear from everyone. So like Sarayu mentioned, please reach out to us if you have any thoughts, any feedback, or anything that you would like to discuss on these things. We will mail you the research report, also the detailed research report, the findings that Aapti shared today, and also the principles overview. So please feel free to reach out to us to discuss on any of those findings. Thank you.